It was early morning near the icy waters surrounding Greenland. The sky was pale, the sea unusually still. The kind of silence that feels almost artificial. No alarms, no headlines, no sense of urgency for anyone not paying very close attention. To the casual observer, nothing seemed out of place. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, and certainly not in a way that would trigger immediate public concern. Yet within military and defense circles, this quiet moment didn't go unnoticed. Because silence in strategic environments is rarely accidental. Over the past few weeks, military analysts began noticing subtle changes in activity patterns near Greenland. Movements that, on paper, looked routine. Aircraft rotations, expanded coordination, presence that could easily be dismissed as standard NATO procedure. But analysts don't look at events in isolation. They look at patterns. And this pattern raised questions. Not because it involved weapons being fired, not because of any public confrontation, but because it appeared to cross what experts often refer to as an invisible strategic line. A line that doesn't exist on maps. A line that isn't announced in press briefings, but one that every serious defense planner understands. For decades, Greenland has sat quietly at the intersection of geography and strategy, remote, frozen, and often overlooked by public discourse. Yet for those studying Arctic security, it has always been more than just ice and distance. It is a vantage point, a listening post, a gateway between continents. So when NATO activity around this region subtly evolved, analysts didn't ask what was happening first. They asked, why now? Because timing in military strategy is rarely random. At first glance, the movements appeared defensive in nature. Coordination exercises, monitoring capabilities, logistical presence. Nothing that violated international norms. Nothing that would justify alarmist headlines. And yet, defense experts began describing the situation using phrases like strategic shift and quiet recalibration. Those aren't words used lightly. They signal that something has changed, not in action, but in intent. What makes this development particularly noteworthy is not its visibility, but its restraint. There were no public declarations, no aggressive messaging, no attempt to draw attention. This wasn't a show of force, it was a signal. And signals are often more powerful when they're understated. In modern geopolitics, escalation doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like positioning, sometimes it looks like preparation, and sometimes it looks like a move so subtle that only analysts trained to read between the lines will notice it. Greenland's location amplifies the significance of any such move. Situated between North America and Europe, bordering key Arctic routes, it plays a quiet but crucial role in early warning systems, surveillance architecture, and strategic depth. Which is why defense assessments don't treat changes in this region as isolated events. They treat them as messages to allies, to competitors, and to anyone paying attention to how the balance of power is quietly evolving.
Some analysts describe this moment as part of a broader, silent escalation. Not an increase in hostility, but an increase in preparedness. Others see it as deterrence, carefully calibrated to avoid provocation while still sending a clear message. And then there are those who believe this move reflects something deeper. A recognition that the Arctic is no longer a distant frontier, but an emerging center of strategic competition. What makes this situation especially complex is that no official line has been publicly crossed. There's no treaty violation to point to, no explicit red line acknowledged by any government. And yet, within defense circles, there's a shared understanding that certain thresholds exist, even when they're never formally defined. Crossing them doesn't trigger war. But it does change calculations. It forces planners to reassess assumptions. It alters risk models. And it reshapes how future moves are interpreted. This is why analysts are watching closely. Not with panic, but with focus. Because moments like these don't announce themselves as historic. They reveal their importance only in hindsight. Years later, analysts often look back and say, "That was the moment things quietly shifted." So the question isn't whether NATO did something dramatic near Greenland. The real question is far more unsettling and far more important. Was this a routine adjustment in a changing world, or the opening move in a much larger strategic realignment that few outside expert circles have even noticed yet? Now, look at the map. At first glance, the waters around Greenland appear empty. Vast stretches of ice-cold ocean, broken only by seasonal shipping lanes and distant coastlines. To many people, it looks like the edge of the world. But in strategic planning rooms, this area is viewed very differently. This is not just open water. This is connective space. Because when analysts examine this region, they don't see isolation, they see linkage. This area quietly connects three critical systems that modern power depends on. First, global trade routes. As Arctic ice patterns change, northern passages are becoming more viable. Not necessarily for mass commercial shipping yet, but for strategic transit and future logistics planning. Even limited access can shorten routes between major economies, reducing time, fuel costs, and dependency on traditional choke points further south. That alone gives this region long-term economic relevance. Second, undersea infrastructure. Beneath these cold waters lies something far more valuable than oil or minerals: data. Undersea data cables form the invisible backbone of the global digital economy. Financial transactions, communications, government systems, all of it flows through cables laid across oceans. Strategic planners don't publicly discuss their exact routes, but they factor their protection and vulnerability into every serious defense assessment. Any region that overlaps with undersea infrastructure instantly becomes a geopolitical hotspot, regardless of how quiet it looks on the surface. And third, military surveillance corridors. Greenland sits at a natural crossroads between North America and Europe. Aircraft, submarines, and long-range monitoring systems passing through or near this zone can observe movements across vast distances. In military doctrine, this isn't called territory, it's called strategic depth. Whoever maintains awareness here doesn't just see what's happening locally, they gain early insight into developments thousands of kilometers away.
That's why defense institutions emphasize doctrine over incidents. Doctrine reveals intent over time. And in recent years, multiple doctrines have quietly converged on the idea that northern regions deserve sustained attention, not as flashpoints, but as buffers, gateways, and sensors. From NATO's perspective, this aligns with long-standing principles of collective awareness and early warning. From other strategic perspectives, it aligns with ensuring freedom of maneuver and protecting national interests. These doctrines don't necessarily collide directly, but they overlap, and overlap creates friction. Importantly, friction does not equal conflict. It means uncertainty, and uncertainty is something militaries plan around aggressively. That's why planners look backward before looking forward. Historical patterns show that when multiple actors increase attention on the same region, even passively, the probability of misinterpretation rises. Not because anyone wants escalation, but because signals multiply faster than intentions. This is why analysts often describe early-stage competition as a signaling environment. Moves are made not to provoke, but to be noticed, to demonstrate capability, to communicate readiness without confrontation. The challenge is that signals are rarely interpreted identically by all observers. One side may see reassurance, another may see encroachment. History shows that most strategic surprises don't come from secret weapons or sudden attacks. They come from assumptions. Assumptions about how a move will be perceived, assumptions about thresholds, assumptions about reactions. And regions like this magnify those risks because of their strategic density. Multiple interests converge, multiple doctrines apply, multiple interpretations coexist. That's why analysts emphasize that escalation often begins long before it becomes visible. By the time headlines appear, the positioning phase is already well underway. This doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. In fact, historical precedent often shows the opposite, that clear positioning can stabilize situations by reducing ambiguity. But only if all parties correctly read the signals. That's the fragile balance. This background context is critical for understanding why recent developments are being watched so closely. Not because they are unprecedented, but because they fit into a known pattern. A pattern where strategic positioning precedes policy shifts, where policy shifts precede operational changes, and where operational changes, if mismanaged, can harden into confrontation. Analysts are not asking whether this region will suddenly become a battlefield. They are asking something far more precise. Has the baseline changed? Because once the baseline shifts, every future move is measured against a new reference point. And that's when quiet adjustments start carrying louder implications. So when attention returns to this region now, it's not driven by fear, it's driven by recognition. Recognition that historical patterns are repeating their early stages. Recognition that doctrines are being tested against real geography. And recognition that positioning, not conflict, is the first chapter of every strategic competition, which leads directly to the next analytical step. If positioning is the real signal, what specific actions are being interpreted as a shift, and why do analysts believe they matter now? Now let's talk about how this region is actually watched. Because according to publicly available defense reports, the assets commonly operating in and around this area don't look dramatic, but they are incredibly powerful. Not because of what they destroy, but because of what they detect. Modern military presence here is built around three overlapping technology layers. First, surveillance aircraft. These platforms don't patrol randomly. They fly calculated patterns designed to map activity over wide areas without crossing overt red lines. Their primary advantage isn't speed or weapons, it's persistence. By staying airborne for long durations, they create continuity. And continuity turns individual observations into patterns. Patterns are where intelligence becomes strategy. Second, signal intelligence platforms. These systems listen far more than they transmit. They collect electronic emissions, radar behavior, communication anomalies. Every active system leaves a signature, and in modern electronic warfare, emitting data is often more revealing than firing a weapon. This is why analysts describe today's battle space as transparent to those who know how to look. You don't need to engage an opponent to learn about them. You only need them to operate normally. Third, undersea monitoring systems. This is where the Arctic environment becomes especially important. Cold water carries sound differently. Acoustic signatures travel farther and behave more predictably. That makes undersea monitoring uniquely valuable here.
Submarines, unmanned sensors, and passive listening networks don't announce themselves. They quietly build awareness over time, and awareness compounds. What makes these systems high value from a content perspective is that they rely on data dominance, not destruction. No explosions, no casualties, no dramatic escalation. Yet the strategic impact can be enormous. Because modern warfare increasingly rewards the side that understands the environment first. Radar reflections tell you movement. Acoustic signatures tell you intent. Electronic emissions tell you capability. Put together, they form a real-time picture of who is doing what and how ready they are. This is why analysts often say, the side that sees first decides first. Decision advantage is everything. If one side can, track changes faster, interpret signals more accurately, share data across allies efficiently, they don't need to escalate. They already control the tempo. From an advertiser's safety standpoint, this matters because the story is not about violence. It's about systems, sensors, and strategy. From a geopolitical standpoint, it matters because these technologies quietly redraw boundaries without anyone firing a shot. This is where the idea of a strategic line becomes relevant. Not a physical line, not a border, but a capability threshold. When new sensors, platforms, or data sharing mechanisms become active in a region, the balance of awareness shifts.
And awareness is power. That's why analysts pay close attention not to headlines, but to hardware. What's flying? What's listening? What's connecting? Because once a surveillance and signal intelligence architecture is in place, it's very difficult to remove, and even harder to ignore. This doesn't automatically mean escalation, but it does mean redefinition. Redefinition of who can see what, redefinition of response time, redefinition of strategic comfort zones. And that's precisely why recent developments around Greenland are being framed not as aggression, but as capability signaling. A message without words, a signal without noise. And that sets up the most important analytical question of all. If technology, not weapons, is doing the talking here, what exactly changed that made analysts say a strategic line may have been crossed? According to multiple defense analysts, the activity observed in this region fits a pattern that modern militaries understand very well. Not an attack, not a provocation in the traditional sense, but a test. A calculated move designed to extract information without triggering escalation. This is what strategists refer to as gray zone action. Gray zone tactics operate in the space between peace and war, where actions are deliberately ambiguous, deniable, and difficult to classify. Nothing explodes, no borders are crossed, no formal warnings are issued. Yet something meaningful happens. In this case, analysts believe the move was less about presence and more about reaction. How fast systems respond, what sensors activate, which decision-makers are alerted, and how information flows through command structures. Because in gray zone competition, the real objective isn't territory, it's insight. Strategic testing works by applying gentle pressure and observing the response curve. Does detection occur immediately or with delay? Are assets scrambled automatically or manually? Is information centralized or shared across allied networks? Every response reveals something, and every revealed detail becomes data. From an analytical standpoint, this kind of activity is especially valuable because it exposes real-world performance, not theoretical capability. Exercises can be scripted, simulations can be optimized, but unscheduled, ambiguous events show how systems behave under uncertainty. That's why analysts emphasize that gray zone actions are often rehearsals, not for conflict, but for understanding. Understanding thresholds, understanding tolerance, understanding where the invisible lines actually are. The key concept here is the escalation threshold. This threshold isn't written down anywhere. It exists as a combination of doctrine, politics, public perception, and risk tolerance. And the only way to map it accurately is to test it. Not violently, but incrementally. A gray zone move might involve operating closer than usual, activating systems in unconventional patterns, expanding presence without formal announcement. Each step remains defensible as routine. Yet collectively, they push the boundary of what is considered normal. This is why analysts stress that gray zone tactics are not accidents. They are designed to ambiguity. They force the other side to make a choice. Respond strongly and risk escalation. Respond lightly and risk normalization. Neither option is comfortable. That's the strategic pressure. Importantly, gray zone actions are also reversible. Assets can withdraw. Systems can power down. Postures can return to baseline. This reversibility is what keeps the action below the level of war and why it's so widely used in modern competition. From a NATO perspective, analysts believe such activity is interpreted less as aggression and more as probing. A way to understand how quickly alliances coordinate, how seamlessly data is shared, and how unified responses appear from the outside. Because in alliance-based defense systems, cohesion is as important as capability. Gray zone testing looks for friction points, delays, conflicting signals, uneven responses. Even small inconsistencies can be informative. That's why observers note that these actions often occur in regions with high strategic value but low public visibility. Places where movements can happen quietly, without triggering immediate media attention. Greenland and its surrounding waters fit that profile. Remote, sparse,
yet deeply connected to global systems. Analysts are careful not to overstate the significance of any single move. But they do track patterns over time, and when patterns shift, interpretations follow. One isolated action may be dismissed as routine. A sequence of similar actions, however, suggests intent. That's where the discussion of a strategic line comes back into focus. Because the line isn't about legality or treaties, it's about expectations. When behavior deviates from established norms, even slightly, it changes how future actions are interpreted. And once expectations shift, the strategic environment changes with them. This is why grey zone actions matter disproportionately. They don't shock the system, they recalibrate it. From a distance, nothing appears dramatic. But inside planning rooms, response matrices are updated, contingencies are revised, and assumptions are quietly retired. That's the real impact. And that's why analysts say these actions are often more consequential than overt shows of force. Because they shape the rules of the game without ever announcing that the game has changed. Which brings us to the final analytical question. If grey zone actions redefine norms rather than break them, what happens if this behavior becomes the new baseline? From a strategic psychology standpoint, the assumption behind many grey zone actions is surprisingly simple. If there's no visible response, there's no response at all. On the surface, that logic feels intuitive. No interception, no press conference, no public warning. Silence. But history shows that assumption is often wrong. Because modern militaries don't always react outwardly. Sometimes they react internally. Strategic psychology isn't about emotions, it's about expectations, and how those expectations shape decision-making. In grey zone environments, silence is frequently misread as hesitation or weakness. In reality, it can mean assessment, data review, pattern comparison, doctrine alignment. In other words, thinking. This is where miscalculation often begins. One side interprets quiet as permission, the other views quiet as preparation. And both sides move forward based on very different assumptions. Analysts point out that modern military organizations are designed to absorb ambiguity without responding impulsively, especially alliances. Because alliance-based systems don't just react, they synchronize. Synchronization takes time. And time, when misunderstood, creates dangerous psychological gaps. From an intelligence assessment perspective, every grey zone action triggers internal processes that never become visible to the public. Sensor logs are reviewed, response timelines are measured, decision chains are tested against doctrine. What looks like inaction from the outside may actually be intense activity on the inside. This is why analysts caution against interpreting silence as strategic comfort. In many historical cases, silence preceded adaptation. Adaptation of tactics, adaptation of thresholds, adaptation of response frameworks. Strategic psychology also highlights another factor: projection. Decision-makers often assume their own risk tolerance is shared by others. It rarely is. What one side considers controlled testing may be perceived by the other as cumulative pressure. And cumulative pressure changes mindset. It shifts planning from reactive to preventative, from tolerance to caution. This is where grey zone competition becomes psychologically unstable, because each side believes it is acting carefully while simultaneously assuming the other side is pushing limits. That mutual suspicion doesn't require hostility, it only requires uncertainty. Analysts studying miscalculation emphasize that most strategic errors are not caused by aggression, but by incorrect assumptions about how actions are interpreted. Especially in regions where communication is indirect. Signals travel through behavior, not statements. Presence becomes message. Movement becomes meaning. In such environments, the psychological burden is heavy. Commanders must decide: is this noise or signal? Is this testing or routine? Is silence safe or dangerous? There are no perfect answers. That's why modern doctrines emphasize resilience over reaction. Absorb, analyze, adjust. Not every signal demands an immediate response, but every signal is recorded. And once recorded, it reshapes future expectations. This is the part many observers miss. They focus on what didn't happen. Analysts focus on what changed internally. Changes in readiness levels, changes in monitoring intensity, changes in planning assumptions. Those shifts don't appear on radar images or headlines, but they are real, and they accumulate. From a psychological standpoint, the greatest risk in gray zone competition isn't escalation, it's misinterpretation. One side believes boundaries are flexible, the other believes boundaries are being mapped. And mapping boundaries is often the last step before redefining them. This doesn't mean conflict is inevitable, but it does mean that mental models are evolving. And when mental models change, strategies follow. That's why analysts watching this region aren't asking who won a particular interaction. They're asking something more subtle. Whose assumptions shifted? Because in strategic competition, victory often comes not from force, but from shaping how the other side thinks. And that brings us to the most important psychological question of all. If silence is being interpreted differently on each side, who is most at risk of miscalculation? The one acting or the one watching? This moment may not appear in headlines. There may be no dramatic footage, no emergency summits, no official statements framed as warnings. But within defense and intelligence circles, it sends a signal, a quiet one. A reminder that modern conflict is no longer defined by explosions alone, but by information dominance. What analysts are watching here isn't a single action, they're watching direction. Because the future of military competition is increasingly shaped by who controls awareness, interpretation, decision speed, rather than who fires first. Strategic signaling today is subtle by design. It avoids shock, it avoids panic, it avoids forcing immediate response. Instead, it reshapes expectations. And expectation management is becoming one of the most powerful tools in modern geopolitics. From a future conflict perspective, this signals a continued shift away from visible confrontation toward persistent competition. A world where sensors matter more than soldiers, data matters more than declarations, silence matters more than statements. This doesn't make conflict less dangerous. It makes it harder to recognize. Military trends over the past decade consistently point in this direction. Investment is flowing toward integrated surveillance systems, cross-domain data sharing, artificial intelligence for pattern recognition, resilience against electronic disruption. These aren't tools of immediate destruction, they're tools of strategic shaping. What happened near Greenland fits cleanly into that trend, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader evolution. Analysts increasingly believe that future flashpoints won't erupt suddenly. They will emerge slowly, through normalization, through repetition, through actions that feel routine, until one day they redefine what routine means. That's why strategic signaling matters more than tactical outcomes. It tells you where norms are moving, and norms, once shifted, are extremely difficult to reverse. Another key signal here is prioritization. Resources are finite. When attention, planning time, and capability investment focus on a particular region, it reflects long-term intent, not short-term reaction. That's why analysts track where effort accumulates, not just what happens. From that lens, this moment suggests that northern regions will continue to gain strategic relevance, not necessarily as battlegrounds, but as platforms. Platforms for monitoring, platforms for early warning, platforms for leverage. And leverage is what future competition revolves around. The ability to influence outcomes before decisions are even made. This also signals a shift in how alliances operate. Coordination,
Data integration and shared situational awareness are becoming the defining strengths and vulnerabilities of collective defense. Future conflicts won't test who has more hardware. They'll test who can see the full picture faster, share it more accurately, act more coherently. In that environment, small signals matter because they reveal readiness, confidence, strategic patience. And patience itself is becoming a strategic weapon. The broader implication is this: modern militaries are preparing for conflicts that may never formally begin, yet never truly end. Persistent competition, continuous signaling, permanent observation. This doesn't mean war is inevitable, but it does mean that peace is no longer passive. It has become active management, management of perception, management of escalation thresholds, management of information flows.